Hello everyone and welcome to a very nice game from this week's Freestyle Friday. It is Hans Niemann versus Hikaru Nakamura. It's a game from round 7 and one of these two gentlemen won the tournament without losing a single game. So let's see which one it is and why it is so impressive. Hans with the white pieces opens with pawn to e4. We have pawn to e4, pawn to e5, and as the title suggests, the 960 King's Gambit. Pawn to f4, we have e captures on f4, accepting the gambit, and now queen captures on f4. Here it doesn't really make sense to call it a King's Gambit since the king is tucked in safely on b1. But, you castle king side and all of a sudden could be, some sort of a similar position. We have pawn to d6 by Hikaru and knight g to f3. Knight e7 preparing to kick away the queen with knight to g6 and rook to f1. Knight to g6 and queen to g3. And Hikaru strikes immediately with pawn to f5. But Hans goes knight to d4 and he says that pawn will not be able to capture. So Hikaru advances it, pawn to f4 and queen to b3, putting pressure on the b7 pawn, so it could be a little bit tricky for Hikaru to develop the light square bishop. At some point, Hans might go bishop f3, e5, and put pressure on that b7 pawn. So bishop to d7, and now knight to d3. Nicely developing, again putting pressure on that f4 pawn, maybe some g3 action in the future. Queen to e7, putting pressure on e4, and Hans goes bishop to f3. You could also go for knight captures on f4, but Hans going for activity instead of material. We have pawn to c6. You can't really just wait for pawn to e5 to open up the light square bishop. So pawn to c6 and pawn to e5. Seemingly a pawn sacrifice, but if you go for knight captures on e5, then after captures and captures, there's knight captures on c6 check as the b pawn is pinned. And after captures, Hans would eliminate Hikaru's light square bishop and would have very nice pressure on the b7 pawn. So Hikaru goes bishop to b6, puts pressure on the undefended knight, and pawn to e6. Hans says, all right, let's trade. We have bishop captures, pawn captures, and queen captures on d7. c3, sorry, not c4, c3, chasing away the bishop, bishop to b6, and now pawn to a4. Okay, Hikaru is up a pawn, but Hans sort of has the attack, and the light square bishop on f3 is extremely powerful. We have queen f3, nicely attacking the knight, and the knight, of course, cannot move. Queen to c2. Knight to f6. We have pawn to a5, attacking the bishop, and now you have to capture it. If you move the bishop, allow pawn to a6, then you weaken the c6 pawn, and then black falls apart fairly quickly. So you have to capture the a5 pawn, and now Hans goes knight captures on f4, where he gives Hikaru some options. He could either trade queens right away, which is definitely possible, something like captures, knight captures, and then rook captures on a5, and the game continues. But Hikaru decides to keep the queens on the board. He plays queen captures on f4, Hans captures the bishop on a5, and queen captures on h2. Hikaru grabs another pawn, and Hans just goes pawn to d4. Opens up the position and grabs the center a little bit. We have rook to e8 and queen to b3. Hans says this game is all about the attack, and you still have a rook on a8. And you can't really just castle queen side because you might have some problems here. Of course, rook captures on a7, and then the king is looking very silly there. So here, king to c7. Hikaru also has to avoid bishop captures on c6 while the king is on b8. We have rook to a4, and Hikaru goes pawn to a5, limiting the mobility of the rook here. We have pawn to c4 and knight to h4, going after the bishop on f3 and pawn to c5, preparing some queen b6, but also just c captures on d6. And while Hikaru could maybe try to do something about that, it is best to play what Hikaru played, and that is knight captures on f3. There's nothing really happening after queen to b6 check. So Hans just recaptures and rook to e1, now preparing to put pressure on that bishop on c1. So queen to f7 with check and knight to d7. Any other move and you're really just getting crushed here. So knight to d7, and now you could go for queen captures on g7, but instead we have rook to e3. It's the only other move that rook to e3, only other move that doesn't give Hikaru the much better position. So rook to e3, we have rook captures, bishop captures, and now rook to f8. Hikaru attacking Hans's queen and gaining control of the game. We have queen captures on g7 and queen to h1 check, king to a2, and rook to f1. Now preparing to go for a king hunt. Rook to a1 check, then queen to d1 check could be a little bit unpleasant. So Hikaru still up a pawn, and he sort of has the attack. But c captures on d6 with check. And now the question is, what are Hikaru's options? Obviously, if you go up the board, then you allow some sort of a queen check, and that pawn there will be really, really an issue. And if you go king to b6, is just checkmate. Or you're going to suffer severe material loss. To give you an example, d5 check. And after king to a6, you will go rook captures on a5. A beautiful rook sacrifice, king captures, and now you bring the queen into the game. Queen c3 check, king a6, queen to a3 with check, king to b5, queen b3 check, king to a5, and now bishop to d2 with check. King a6, queen to a4 check, king to b6, and queen to a5 will, of course, be checkmate, as the pawns are preventing the king from reaching the light squares. So after c captures on d6, we have king captures, and now queen to g3 with check, king to e6, and queen to g4 with check, king e7, and bishop to g5 with check. You can see that Hans is already really low on time, down to 2 seconds, and he's playing an increment. We have knight to f6 by Hikaru, and the position is winning now for Hans, but 2 seconds on the clock. He goes queen to e2 with check. I know you guys see the winning idea without me even showing it to you. Of course, it is pawn to d5. I know you guys saw it. You guys are amazing players. Point is that after rook a1 check and king to b3, you simply don't have time to capture, as the queen is coming to e6. And if you continue checking with queen d1 check, even if you trade queens, captures, there's still the problem of losing the knight. Rook e4 check, and now if the king goes away, you just pick up the knight, and of course if king f7, rook f4, and you lose the knight on the next move. So that's the way to go. Hans, on the other hand, went queen to e2 with check. We have king to f7, and he played bishop captures on f6, where, although very nice, it is now an equal position. Rook captures on f6, and the rook captures on a5. Equal position, equal material, but, Hikaru has 10 seconds extra. Hans is playing with 1 second on the clock, plus the little increment that he gets. We have queen to f1. Immediately, Hikaru offers a trade, and Hans even trades. We have captures, and the rook to a7. So now this is a battle of pre-moving. We have king to g6, rook captures on b7, and rook to f4. Going after the d pawn, we have rook to b6 going after the c pawn, rook captures, and rook captures on c6 with check. King g5 and rook to c2 guarding the pawns, and now it's time for Hans to consolidate. He's up a pawn, but still a position like this cannot be won with perfect play. But with so little time on the clock, perfect play is not something that is easy to achieve. And here there are many good moves, for example, like pawn to f5, king to f4, but Hikaru played king to f5, and this is one of those moves that just loses in the game, even though it seems like you can play literally anything. What is Hans's path to victory? It's, I would give you a hint, but it's always that. So have at it. Yes, I know you guys are looking at pawn to b4, and it is pawn to b4, but you have to prepare it. King to a3. It is the only move that wins, and now Hans is just faster. Hikaru is not in time to stop the pawn, and he's not in time to go after the g2 pawn to maybe start advancing his past h-pawn also to the queening square. So king to e6, now pawn to b4. We have king to d7, king to a4, pawn to h5, and Hans goes king to a5. We have pawn to h4, pawn to b5. We have rook to d1, and here pawn to b6, and now of course you can see that there is no reaching that pawn. Rook to a1 with check, king to b5. We have rook to b1 with check, king to a6, rook to a1 with check, and king to b7. And it seems like there's no way for that white king to move, so the white pawn can march forward. But of course there is, as Hikaru has to make a move. If he moves the king, then the white king escapes. If he moves the rook, then okay, the rook probably can move, but if you move the pawn, of course, you lose the pawn. So he plays rook to h1. Now, if you go this way, then, of course, you check the king right back. So king to a7, rook to a1 with check. We have king to b8, and now rook to h1. Hans plays pawn to b7. Hikaru goes rook to a1, again controlling Hans's king. But now Hans just played rook to d2 with check, and he was in this position on move 56 that Hikaru Nakamura resigned the game, as there is nothing more to be done here. And of course he knows it, and after a move like king to e7, there are many ways you can win this, but rook to d4 seems to be the simplest way. And now after, let's say, rook a2, we trade pawns, captures, and now you just go back. Rook to h6, and you will have a path for your king. Rook to c2, you stop the king from reaching the c file, but then rook to a6, and there's no stopping that king from going to a7 or a8. King to d7, just a nice king to a8, and now you cannot advance with the king because the pawn queens. And if you go rook to b2, then just b8 queen, you have to give it up, and then, of course, king and rook will checkmate the black king in some 8 moves. So yeah, very nicely played by Hans, and he played most of the game with 1 second on the clock, so that makes it even more impressive. And this is something that I find very interesting. Look at the final standings. So these are the final standings of this week's Freestyle Friday. You have Hans Niemann in first place with 10 points. He won all of the games, only had 2 draws. Tuan Minle with 9.5. Then Ihor Samunekov, Mitra Baguha, Matthias Blubam, Sergej Zhigalkov, Ugar Rasulov, Simon Gumulars, Sina Movahed, Renato Terry, Platon Galperin, Alexis Arana, Dmitry Kolars, Bogdan Daniel Deak, and Aravind Chitambaram. And although you know some of these names, some of them you don't know, and some of them you don't see. For example, when a Title Tuesday is played, then you have some regular names that are always present in the top 10, top 15, where regular chess is played. But here, where Chess 960 is played, it's very different than in regular chess. But Hans seems to be winning both regular chess and irregular chess, in this case 960, which just shows that he's the complete fighter. He just wants to fight for move 1. If he gets a nice position, like Bobby Fischer used to play, at some point, he just wanted to play fighting chess. You give up a pawn. Even in this game, you saw that he just, gives up a pawn, gives up 2 pawns. He doesn't care. He goes after Hikaru's king. Then, okay, Hikaru defends. He has to give back some material, and then Hans just outplays him with 1 second on the clock. So very impressive performance. And yeah, I don't usually show a lot of games, but it's once per week we can show 1 game. I thought this was definitely the one to show. So hope you guys enjoyed it. So yeah, that's the game. Really hope you enjoyed it. I would like to thank Nikola Nenad Stankovic, Eric Vasquez, Thomas Pasternak, Alan Charbonneau, and Seshadri Subramanian for your contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing to check up on your wonderful suggestions and whatever else happens in the chess world. Thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.